It was November 1942, and the cold that year came early and stayed personal. The kind of cold that found the gaps in your coat, that crept beneath doors, that pressed against the window panes with the persistence of something that wanted inside. The village of WWII sat in the Lublin district of German-occupied Poland, close enough to the main road to receive the war's tremors, but small enough to hope always foolishly, always desperately, that it might be overlooked. 412 people, a square of pale limestone buildings, a church whose bell still rang on Sundays because the Germans hadn't yet decided it was worth taking, a bakery, a mill, a schoolhouse, a pharmacy run by a man named Alexander Wittek, who hadn't slept a full night in 14 months. Alexander was 41 years old and built like a question mark, slightly stooped, perpetually leaning forward as though listening for something just beyond the range of ordinary hearing. Before the war, he'd been known in WWII as a careful man, a methodical man, one who dispensed medicines with the precision of someone who understood that the wrong amount of anything could kill. The occupation had not changed him so much as it had revealed him, stripped away the ordinary life that surrounded his character and showed what was underneath. What was underneath, it turned out, was harder than anyone, including Alexander, had expected. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. He was at the pharmacy window when the convoy passed on that November morning, 3 Wehrmacht trucks and a black car he recognized as Gestapo by its plates, moving east through the square without stopping. He watched until the vehicles disappeared into the fog beyond the mill, then turned from the window and descended the back stairs to the cellar. "They've passed," he said to the dark. From the dark came the sound of 10 people exhaling. There were 10 of them. The Goldberg family, Mordecai, a former bookseller from Lublin who had been visiting his cousin in WWII when the deportations began and had simply, in the terrible arithmetic of circumstance, not been able to leave. His wife Rivka, who had been a seamstress and who now repaired the town's clothing in secret in exchange for food she slipped through the panel at night. Their children, 15-year-old Hannah, 12-year-old Shmuel, and 7-year-old twins named Dov and Razel. And the Ehrlichs, Benjamin Ehrlich, a clockmaker, and his wife Chaya, and their elderly father, Avram, who was 73 and had survived the First War and the influenza pandemic of 1918, and now sat in the cellar of a Polish pharmacist's shop and read psalms from memory in a whisper, so constant and so quiet it had become, for the others, a kind of background to existence. The sound of prayer, as ambient noise, as wallpaper, as the hum the world made when it was paying attention. Benjamin's daughter, 4-year-old Merle, was the 10th. 10 people beneath a pharmacy in a town that officially did not know they existed. Alexander climbed back upstairs and returned to the window. The fog had closed again over the road east. The crows had not yet returned to the birches. He put a kettle on the stove and stood with his back to it, warming his hands behind him, and thought, as he thought every morning, with the same precise pharmacist's inventory of risk, about everything that could go wrong today. The list was never short. The danger was not theoretical. It had a name, a date, a location. Józefów, August 1942, 40 kilometers south of WWII. In Józefów, a Polish family named Kowalczyk had been found sheltering 3 Jewish men in their barn. The Goelczyks, the father, the mother, 2 teenage sons had been executed in the barn alongside the men they'd been hiding. The story had traveled the district the way horror travels in wartime, in fragments, in averted eyes, in the specific silence that falls when someone starts to tell it and then stops. Everyone in WWII knew the Józefów story. Alexander knew it. Father Benedict Krawczyk, the priest, knew it. Zofia Marek, who taught mathematics in the reopened school and who was the youngest of the group at 26, knew it so well she sometimes recited it to herself at night as a kind of inoculation against complacency. The group had come together gradually, the way most conspiracies form, not through a single dramatic decision, but through a series of smaller ones, each of which seemed manageable until you looked back and saw how far you'd walked. Alexander had been first because the Goldbergs had come to his door. Father Benedict had been second because Alexander needed someone who could move through the village without suspicion. Zofia had been third because she'd noticed the food quantities Alexander was ordering from the district supplier and had come to him directly, without accusation, and said, "Tell me what you need." The fourth member was Stanislaw Gorka, the miller, a widower in his 50s with enormous hands and a quietness that in any other context might read as simple, but was in fact the quietness of a man who had decided, some years before, that speech was less reliable than action. When Father Benedict had explained the situation to him, Stanislaw had listened without expression and then said, "I have space under the grain floor, if it becomes necessary." He said nothing else. He went back to his mill. He was, in the judgment of everyone who knew him, the most dependably brave person in WWII, because he was brave in the manner of someone who had simply never entertained the alternative. What made the arrangement precarious beyond the obvious was the presence of Commandant Friedrich Hess, the German officer assigned to the WWII district. Hess was neither the monster of propaganda nor the reluctant soldier of sympathy. He was something more specifically dangerous, a thorough man. He conducted inspections on irregular schedules, which meant they could not be anticipated. He asked questions that circled back on each other, and he noticed inconsistencies the way a craftsman notices a joint that doesn't quite meet. He had, in the past 3 months, arrested 2 men in the district for lesser violations, and had done so with the same paperwork and procedure manner as someone processing a routine transaction. And he had taken, Zofia had noticed, an interest in Alexander's pharmacy. "He comes in twice a week," she told Father Benedict one evening. "For aspirin, he says, but he stands at the counter and looks around as if he's making a list." "He may be making a list," the priest said. "Then we need to be smarter than his list." The cellar beneath the pharmacy had one entrance, a hatch behind the dispensing counter. Concealed beneath a heavy oak cabinet that rolled on concealed casters Alexander had designed himself, spending 3 nights in November 1941 with a hand drill and hardware stolen from an abandoned farm. The cabinet looked fixed. It moved when you knew where to press and how. The space below was divided by Alexander into 2 sections. The front section, visible if the hatch was opened, contained genuine inventory, glass bottles, surplus medicines, wooden crates of bandaging supplies. Everything legitimate, everything explainable. The back section, separated by a false wall built from the same oak as the shelving above, was where the 10 people lived. It measured roughly 4 meters by 5. It had a low ceiling that Mordecai Goldberg, who was tall, navigated by permanent habit, his head always slightly bowed. It had a ventilation pipe that Stanislaw had run through the mill's drainage system, disguised as a water runoff conduit. It had a single oil lamp that burned only at night and only on the lowest possible wick. Rivka Goldberg had, in the first month, organized the space the way a ship's cook organizes a galley, with an obsessive, practical economy that turned limitation into system. Sleeping was arranged in shifts, the older children taking days, the adults taking nights. Food was consumed in strict portions, Rivka having once quietly and without making it a scene redistributed Mordecai's portion to Dove, who had been losing weight in a way she didn't like, and told Mordecai afterward in a whisper so private it was almost inaudible, "You'll eat more tomorrow. Tonight our son needs it more." Mordecai had said nothing. He understood. Hannah Goldberg, at 15, had become the cellar's informal school teacher. She spent hours each day teaching the twins their letters, teaching Myril Ehrlich to count, maintaining in the children some forward motion of mind to counter the suspended animation of their bodies. She used whatever was at hand, the backs of medicine labels Alexander passed down, stubs of pencil, Schmoll's excellent memory. She taught the way she'd been taught, by repetition, by patience, by the conviction that learning was a form of resistance, that every new word the children mastered was a small, private defiance. Benjamin Ehrlich repaired the townspeople's clocks in the cellar and passed them back up through Alexander. This was Zofia's idea, a way to maintain the illusion of his absence as a choice rather than a disappearance, and a way to generate enough goodwill that the townspeople whose clocks he fixed might ask fewer questions about where he'd gone. The clocks went in broken and came back running. Nobody asked. People, Alexander reflected, were remarkably incurious about miracles when the miracles were convenient. Old Abraham Ehrlich prayed. He prayed in the morning, facing east as best as he could estimate the direction in a basement beneath a Polish town. He prayed in the evening. He prayed at noon. He taught little Myril the Shema, his hands resting on her small head, his voice at the level of breathing. Alexander, passing food through the hatch one afternoon, heard the ancient words rising through the floor like heat, and stood still for a moment with the bread in his hands. Not a religious man himself, but moved by something he couldn't name, the persistence of it, the refusal of it. The way a prayer said in a cellar in 1942 connected backward to every cellar and cave and attic where the same words had been said by the same kind of faith under the same kind of faith for 2,000 years. He closed the hatch carefully and went back to his counter and dispensed aspirin to a German officer who stood looking around the room as if counting things. The 1st, December, a surprise inspection. 4 soldiers, no advance warning. Alexander had 7 minutes from the moment Zofia's nephew spotted them at the village entrance to the moment they arrived at the pharmacy door. 7 minutes. He spent 4 of them getting the 10 people from the front cellar to the back section behind the false wall, and 3 of them restoring the hatch to its normal position and pushing the oak cabinet back over it, and placing, on top of the cabinet, a large crate of bottles he'd been saving for exactly this purpose, because the crate looked like it had been there for years. The soldiers searched for 20 minutes. They opened every cabinet. They tapped on walls. One of them tried to move the oak cabinet and found it, correctly, too heavy to shift without real effort, and turned away. Beneath the floor, Razel Goldberg held her twin brother Dov's hand so tightly that the next morning his fingers bore the marks of her grip. She did not speak. He did not speak. 7 years old, the 2 of them in the dark holding on. The 2nd, February. Shia Ehrlich became ill, a chest illness, the kind that in ordinary times would have been unpleasant and in these times was catastrophic. Not because illness was unexpected in those conditions, but because illness in a sealed space makes sounds, coughing, the specific catch of difficult breathing, sounds that carry through floorboards and walls in ways that silence cannot control. Alexander gave her everything he had, genuine medicines, used sparingly, saved from his own supply. Sophia brought a honey preparation she made at home that Alexander passed down. Father Benedict prayed over the floor. For 9 days, every time a German patrol passed along the street outside, Mordecai Goldberg pressed a folded cloth gently over Chaya's face, not to smother, but to muffle, and Chaya, who understood exactly what he was doing and why, pressed her own hand over his and helped hold it in place. Benjamin sat beside his wife through all of it, his clockmaker's hands still for the first time since any of them could remember. She recovered. On the 10th day, her breathing cleared. Benjamin wept silently for an hour in the corner that served as his private space, and nobody mentioned it. The 3rd, March. A boy from the village 15 years old, the son of a family that kept to themselves, came to the pharmacy and told Alexander he'd seen a light beneath the back door of the cellar hatch at night. He said it matter-of-factly. Not with threat, but with the uncertain directness of a teenager who wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with what he knew. Alexander looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "You didn't see anything. And if you think very carefully about what you're seeing something would mean for you, for your family, for this town, I believe you'll agree with me." The boy left. He never spoke of it. Alexander fixed the light seal that night, working by touch in the dark rather than risk another lamp. The 4th, April. Commandant Hess conducted a full district sweep following intelligence from somewhere, from someone that families were being concealed in the Wilka-Wola area. He arrived with 12 soldiers and a translator and spent 2 days moving systematically through the village. He came to the pharmacy on the 2nd day, and this time he did not come for aspirin. Alexander was ready. He had spent 3 days preparing a version of the pharmacy's back storage area, so meticulously ordinary that it was almost a performance, real dust, arranged, real disorder calibrated, real irrelevance curated with the care of a museum exhibit. The false wall had been treated with the same grime as the surrounding stone. Hess spent 40 minutes in the pharmacy. He opened the hatch, the real hatch, the legitimate cellar entrance at the side wall, the one that led to genuine storage and nothing else. He went down himself with a lamp. He tapped walls. He spent 8 minutes below ground while Alexander stood at his counter and compounded a preparation for a soldier's infected foot and kept his hands perfectly steady. Hess came up. He looked at Alexander. "Your records?" he said. "Inventory. Supply receipts." All of it. Alexander presented them without pause. Every receipt was genuine. Every quantity was accounted for, except for the food. But food receipts were not a pharmacy's business, and Hess, to Alexander's profound, almost fainting relief, did not think to ask about food. He left. He did not come back. The 5th and worst came in June. The informant's name was never confirmed. What was confirmed pieced together afterward from fragments was that a letter had been sent to the district Gestapo office in Lublin, naming Alexander Wittek, naming the pharmacy, naming the Goldberg family specifically by name. Whoever wrote the letter knew enough to be believed. Enough to send not a patrol but an operation. 8 Gestapo agents, 2 translators, a German shepherd on a chain, and Commandant Hess himself, arriving at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in June, when the air smelled of linden blossoms and the square was empty and the moon was full enough to read by. Sophia saw them from her window. She slept lightly, she always slept lightly, and ran barefoot through the back lanes to the pharmacy in 4 minutes. The Gestapo were still 2 streets away when she arrived and hammered on Alexander's door with the flat of her palm. He was already awake. He heard the vehicles. The mill, he said. Stanislaw, now. This had been planned. Stanislaw's contingency. The space beneath the grain floor was larger, less known, and had never been used for precisely this reason. It was to be held in reserve for the worst case. The worst case had arrived, moving 10 people through the back lanes of WWII at 2 in the morning, with 8 Gestapo agents 2 streets away, with a German shepherd whose hearing extended well beyond the range of human precaution, is an exercise in the kind of focus that narrows the entire world to the next 6 seconds. Alexander went first, checking each turn. Sophia took the children, Hannah carrying Mirel, Shmuel holding the twins by the hand, moving on the grass alongside the lane rather than the stones, because stones made sound. Old Abraham Ehrlich could not move quickly. Benjamin and Chaya supported him on either side, and the 3 of them moved in the specific shuffle of people trying to be both fast and silent and finding the 2 demands almost incompatible. Mordecai and Rivka came last, and Mordecai paused at the corner for a single second and looked back toward the pharmacy, the building that had sheltered his family for 7 months, the building that was now about to be torn apart by men with a dog in a list. He looked at it once. Then he turned and followed his family into the dark. Stanislaw had the grain floor open. No words were exchanged. 10 people descended. The floor closed. At the pharmacy, the Gestapo found nothing. The false wall held. The cabinet held. The receipts held. Alexander Wittek, detained for 6 hours in the village hall, answered every question in the same methodical, unhurried way he dispensed medicine. Correctly, precisely, without excess. He did not shake, he did not deflect. He looked Hess in the eye and told a truth that contained no lies, but omitted the one fact that would have ended everything. At 6 in the morning he was released for insufficient evidence. He walked back through the square in the early light, past the church where Father Benedict was ringing the morning bell, past the bakery where the smell of the first bread was just beginning to find the street. He walked to the mill. Stanislaw opened the grain floor. 10 faces looked up at him from below. Alexander Wittek sat down on the mill floor and pressed both hands over his eyes and breathed. "It's over," he said. "You're safe." Mordecai Goldberg climbed out of the floor and put both hands on Alexander's shoulders and said, in Polish, the only language they shared, "God sees you." Then he couldn't continue, so he didn't try. The Red Army reached the Lublin district in late July 1944. The Germans left WWII on a Tuesday in vehicles loaded with requisitioned goods, moving west with the haste of people who had stopped pretending they had chosen to be somewhere. The last staff car passed through the square at dawn and did not stop and did not return. By noon, the village had gathered in the square in a quiet that wasn't silence, but the absence of the specific dread that had lived in every silence for 4 years. People stood in small groups and said little, and looked at each other with expressions calibrated for a feeling that had no ready language. Not quite joy, not quite relief, something rawer and more private than either. The feeling of a weight removed that you'd carried so long you'd forgotten what your spine felt like without it. Alexander opened the grain floor for the last time just before noon. They came up into a July day so bright was almost aggressive. The twins blinking and shielding their eyes, Mirel Ehrlich holding her father's hand and looking at the sky with an expression of absolute astonishment, as though the sky itself was something that required introduction. Hannah Goldberg, 16 now and taller than she'd been in the cellar, walked to the mill door and stood in the sunlight for a long moment with her eyes closed and her face lifted and didn't move, and nobody hurried her. Avram Ehrlich walked into the square and found a patch of ground facing east. He stood there and prayed, and this time his voice was not a whisper. It carried across the stones of the square and into the summer morning with no apology and no concealment, and the people of Wilka Wola who heard it and understood what it meant stood still and let it fill the air. Rivka Goldberg found Zofia Marek in the crowd and took her face in both hands and looked at her for a long time without speaking. Zofia, who had not cried once in 14 months of sustained, exhausting terror, cried then. Rivka held her and said nothing, which was everything. Benjamin Ehrlich went to the pharmacy and stood in front of the oak cabinet for a while. Then he went behind the counter and found the tools Alexander kept there, and, without being asked, began repairing the dispensing mechanism that had been stiff for weeks. His clockmaker's hands moved with the precise confidence they always had, as though the previous 20 months had been an interruption, and he was simply resuming. Father Benedict rang the church bell that evening, not the clipped, cautious ring of the occupation years, but the full, unguarded peal of it, every toll deliberate and unhurried, filling the Lublin evening from tree line to tree line. Commandant Hess was captured by Soviet forces 6 weeks later near Krakow. He was tried and did not ask for mercy. The informant was never identified with certainty. The families left Wilka Wola in the months following liberation. The Goldbergs eventually to Palestine, later Israel, the Ehrlichs to relatives in England, then to New York. They carried with them what every hidden person carries out of hiding, the knowledge of exactly how much the darkness cost, and exactly who lit the lamp inside it. Alexander Wittek ran his pharmacy in Wilka Wola until 1971. He was recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem in 1967, an honor he received in a letter and placed in a drawer and rarely discussed. When asked about it, he said only that he had done what a pharmacist does, assessed what was needed and provided it in the correct amount. Zofia Marek taught mathematics in Wilka Wola for 37 years. In her classroom, on the wall above the blackboard, she kept a single photograph. 10 people standing in a square of July sunlight outside a mill, squinting into brightness, alive. Father Benedict died in 1959. His eulogy was given by Mordecai Goldberg, who traveled from Haifa to deliver it, standing in the church where the priest had once forged documents by lamplight and told a frightened woman the truth about Józefów, and who said in Polish, in a voice that did not waver, "This man believed that what God asks of us is not safety, it is presence." Stanislaw Gorka never spoke publicly about what he had done. He continued to run the mill. He continued to be quiet. He died in 1978, and at his funeral, the square was full. What is it, finally, that Wilka Wola teaches us? Not that heroism is easy. It was not easy. It cost these people sleep and safety, and the kind of peace of mind that, once spent, is not fully recovered. It cost them years of sustained, grinding fear. Not the sharp fear of a single moment, but the accumulated weight of 1,000 mornings when the crows rose from the birch trees and something inside each of them went cold and still and had to be talked privately back to steadiness. Not that good people always outnumber bad ones. History doesn't reliably confirm this. In many towns across occupied Europe, the hiding failed. The letters were sent, the doors were answered, the cellars were found, the arithmetic came out differently. But it teaches us something more specific and more demanding than those comforts, that in the worst circumstances human beings can construct, there are always people who do not perform a calculation between self-interest and conscience, who instead simply, in the way Stanislaw Gorka, simply say yes when asked and then get on with the work. The Goldbergs survived. The Ehrlichs survived. Leah Little Myriel grew up in New York and became a doctor. Old Abraham Ehrlich, who had survived the First War and the flu and 2 years in the cellar, died in 1951 at the age of 82 in a bed in London with his son Benjamin beside him and his daughter-in-law Chaya holding his hand and the morning prayer on his lips. Wilke Wola survived too. The question the town leaves us with is not a comfortable one. It is not, how could people do such evil? History has answered that question exhaustively. The question Wilka Wola leaves us with is the harder one, the one that requires something from the person asking it when the moment comes, and for someone, somewhere, it always comes. What will you do with the 7 minutes you have?